Here at the Jane Goodall Research Center at USC, where we have probably the largest video archive of wild chimpanzee behavior that exists. And the first let me tell you the title of Jane's talk is going to be how young chimpanzees acquire culture. The first of the presentations on video will be by Norm Rosen and DePompei, and they've been working with me on a most puzzling chimpanzee vocalization, which is called the wah. And normally I give examples of all vocalizations when I talk about them. However, because chimps are going to be coming along with the real thing right after, I'm a little bit hesitant. So let me just say that the wah call sounds a little bit like this. Wah! It's a call which we're trying to figure out as to its meaning, because it definitely is used in contexts where a subordinate adult is expressing defiance toward a higher ranking adult. But we're also finding out that it's used in other contexts, and I'm going to let the presentation speak for itself with respect to some of the other contexts where a higher ranking chimp uses the same call on lower ranking chimps. Let me just set up the first scene that you're going to see on video. Imagine a little orphan chimpanzee named Mel who's watching a couple of females who are in dense foliage. They're feeding on something called mbula, which are sort of like plums that get ripe and fall on the ground and taste terrible. If a human eats them, it tastes wonderful if a chimp eats them. And Gigi, who is a high-ranking female, will come along, see that Scotia and Spray are feasting on these mbula, and because Gigi outranks them, she's going to displace them. And as they leave, because they know Gigi's more interested in eating their mbula than in attacking them, they're going to give some wah calls. And then after that, they're going to, because they're frustrated, they're going to turn their frustration on one another, which happens with chimps. They often redirect their aggressions. And they'll wah at each other, and then you're also going to see the alpha male come in and break up the incipient fight between these two females who have been disenfranchised of their mbula. And without any further introduction, let's have DePompei, Norm Rosen, and they will explain each scene in the research that they've been doing along with me on the wah vocalization.
Before we get started, just to give you a little outline, although Chris took some of our thunder there, but he really is the expert. And I don't dare make a wah because Jane's in the audience, and if anybody's ever heard her do any vocalizations, you know, if we were to do something, she would flash up a sign and say 4. Really, the archives that we have here in the Anthropology department are wonderful because it really is a large body of work which has been cataloged. We have all kinds of dates which you can associate different chimps at Gombe. We know who the animals are. We've got very meticulous notes, but even with all of that, everything has been computerized. And so Jim and myself have been working on this project. You'll only see it for maybe 10 minutes totally, but the two of us were walking around the Anthropology department making pant grunts and wahs, because after you see a number of hours of this video, it really comes ingrained. I think the important issue when you're looking at vocalizations is the fact that you can see a lot of communications, and for those of you that have read Jane's book on Gombe, which has got at least a few chapters or more on the subject of vocalization, it's incredible how you can see the different gestures and the vocalizations and how you can determine whether they're aggressive or non-aggressive or whatever. So with that as a background, Jim, why don't you get it started?
Okay. Well, the first thing we have to see, as Chris so marvelously introduced, much better than I could ever do, is a display by Goblin, who is a high-ranking male. And he is trying to quell a fight that's happening between two females. Unfortunately, you can't see the female fight, but you can hear it in the background. It's a mishmash of screams, wah barks. It's basically chaos. But my favorite part in this entire thing is little Melly is in the front. He's this cute little chimpanzee. He's in the front playing with a tree, and when he starts hearing the wah barks, you can kind of see his expression. He gets scared, and then up comes Goblin over this tree trunk, and he goes shooting away. It's really great. So if we could see it, that'd be wonderful. This is the wonderful blue sky at Gombe. There we go. Can you turn up the audio, please? Is there any possible way to turn up the audio? Well, while they're working on the glitch, that's the type of thing that we watch. That's one of the more exciting things that we watch on the video. It's really loud, and when you have the TV up and at a sound where you can hear it comfortably, as soon as they start screaming and yelling, it can be heard throughout the entire anthropology department. People come walking into the room like, well, what's going on in here? I thought that was a dog or something. It's really wonderful. That's basically shows you how complicated it is to try to study vocalizations through tapes and through such what I believe is a complicated creature as well. They're more complicated than most people tend to believe. Those there are wobblers. Okay, if you could pause it. The next segment that I'm going to show you is the context really can't be seen by what's on the screen, which is why we use a transcription at the same time. So while you're watching these videos, you read along in a transcription in Swahili and also in English. So it gets very interesting. And you can hear Hilali, who is the field assistant who recorded most of these. You can hear his Swahili over a lot of this. But the next one is numerous wahs. There's, unfortunately, the context can't be seen, like I said earlier, but it's clear that these are wah barks, and it's a possibility that it's an alarm, some type of alarm, but they're all up in the trees and very clear wahs. If we could see that, please.
Katika kundi la Masokwe.
And you can hear all the different variations of the wah bark. It's not just one single wah. There's higher grades. There's separate reasons why they're used. And in number 3, we go back to Scotia and spray, as in the earlier one. Scotia, again, is screaming, probably over food of some sort, and Spray begins to wah over her screaming to try to make her be quiet. Unfortunately, it's hard to see the chimpanzees, but you can hear them quite well.
Huyo nayo sikilimu ni Sikosha.
Okay, number 4, our fourth one is, hence the name number 4, is the many varieties of the different types of wah barks. Again, they're actually different than the ones that you heard in the second one. So, if we could show this one. That wah could possibly be over a food right, being a place in a tree where one chimp was eating and then left, and then another chimp took over those ripe fruits, and the first chimp could come back up and start wahing at them to make them go away because that was their find. The next one here involves a little bit of explaining. It's rather confusing the first couple of times I've seen it, and I had to get Chris to come down and watch it with me, and we watched it about 10-15 times before I actually understood it very well. It involves Melly, again, and Melly is at the bottom of a hill playing with a stranger chimpanzee, and little Tubi, who is the main character in this scene, he wants to play with Melly as well, but the stranger chimp doesn't want Tubi to be down there, so the stranger chimp attacks Tubi, and Tubi is looking for assistance from the older chimpanzees who are on top of the hill. And what ensues is a spectacular wah bark by Gigi, who comes down, and you can actually see that it stops the fight. So if we could see that. That's Tubi. Down at the bottom are two black hunks, which are the chimpanzees. In this next one, it involves almost exactly the same chimpanzees. This one, the entire action which involves the wah bark happens off-screen, but you can see what ensues. Most of the parents grab their respective offspring, and then as soon as it's over, it's back to normal, back to play, back to everything as usual. I forgot to mention that Fifi, who's the one over in the corner, when she waws, she uses her hands quite a bit, which is a distinctive characteristic that goes along with the wah bark as well. The entire hand gestures and everything, which is also something that's very complicated to study at the same time. In that one, it's rather tough to tell. What we believe what happened in the transcription was that there was a slight tiff between two of the infant chimpanzees, and up higher in the trees, and the moms just wanted the fight to stop. So they started wahing, and they grabbed their own children, and then they wahhed to make it stop, and it stopped, so then everything went back to normal. This next one is a great example of a single wah. So you get one voice, one wah. And once again, we don't really know what it's for, but it sounds like an I don't really like you that much wah. So to use those scientific terms. And this last one, which is my favorite, and it was pointed out to me by Chris, is two of the older males are eating meat that they recently hunted down and caught, and one of the alpha male's younger brother is trying to beg for meat from them, and they don't want anything to do with him, so they wah at him to make him go away, which is a great example of the wah bark. These are just but a few of the different examples of the wah bark. There's countless examples where the wah bark is used. It's a very commonly heard vocalization along with the countless other vocalizations heard as well. And this is just the beginning of a study that could last for quite some time. Now I'd like to introduce Emily, who is going to be presenting to you.
I think that at this early stage of our research, we can't say exactly what a wah is, except that it's hostile, and that it seems to be used in different contexts of subordination, that is, subordinate relationships or superior relationships, and that it is sometimes used by adults to control juveniles. And in terms of Jane's lecture, when we showed you the maybe second or third from the end, where there were, the mother went and grabbed her infant, that was Fifi grabbing Flossie, and pulled her away from a conflict with another infant. The two mothers were wahing at each other, but you couldn't see the other mother, she was up in a tree. And Gigi actually got up ready to stop the conflict if it developed between the mothers. And then what's interesting from the standpoint of how little chimps learn is that Fifi was wahing at the other mother at the same time her juvenile daughter was giving a juvenile version of the wah, and her infant, the one who had been saved from the conflict, at the very end gave a little kind of a chirp that was an infant wah. Now we're going to go to a study which is very directly involved with socialization. Emily Yutt from UCLA is going to talk about research she's been doing in which she looks at the structure of attention and how little chimps become interested in tool-using technology, specifically the acquisition of termites using termite tools. So I'll turn it over to Emily now.
Let's see, can everyone hear me all right? Yep. Okay. Anyhow, at Gombe, the mature adult-like form of the fishing technique used to obtain termites is fully developed by chimps while they're still juveniles. That is, their behaviors are indistinguishable from that of adults by the time they're about 5 to 6 years old. The question that interested me and my advisor was, how does this behavior develop in young chimpanzees? According to Jane Goodall, It's a combination of experience handling the objects that would later serve as tools, as well as observational learning. Okay, as Chris mentioned, my background is in psychology, so I have the psychologist's impulse to quantify everything. So basically what we did was to go through the archive and find instances in which there was tool use involved, termite feeding by adults in the presence of juveniles between the ages of 0 years and 6 years. And basically what we were looking at was what the juveniles were doing while the adults were engaging in termite feeding behaviors. I guess I should give you a brief description of what the termite feeding behaviors involved. Chimps engage in termite feeding with, well, occasionally, sometimes they use tools and sometimes they don't. When they use a tool, they find like a stick or a piece of grass or something that's flexible and long, and what they do is they insert it into a termite tunnel below ground, wait for the termites to crawl onto the piece of grass or the stem or whatever, and then they slowly withdraw their tool and eat the termites off the tool. At other times, they will pick up termites from the surface of the ground by picking them up with their fingers or using their forearm and rubbing it against the ground for the termites, so that the termites will cling to their fur, and then eating them off their forearms. So let's see. Anyhow, as I said, we went through the archives, found examples of tool use behaviors, and this is basically what we found. Let's see. In the first clip, which is of a chimp who is under 1 year of age, primarily the chimps were not all that involved with what the adults were doing in the way of termite feeding. They basically ignored what the demonstration being provided by the adults, and instead were they were minimally involved with the termite feeding. Occasionally they'd look over and try to get a little bit involved, but primarily they seemed more interested in engaging the adults socially, or they might want to go back to sleep, or they might feed, or they might try to nurse. But in essence, they tended, for the most part, to ignore the termite feeding behaviors going on. Can we see the first clip?
Kitambaa akiwa ni figis, kitambaa kwa Fani ambaye ni mama yake.
Pause, please. All right. Now, the second thing that we found was that young chimpanzees do engage in quite a bit of stick play before they start to fish. That is, they get experience handling sticks before they start using them as tools. So this confirms what Jane's assertion and what she observed in the field. Can we see that clip? Pause, please. Okay, that chimp was about 1 year old. Now, chimps don't, Jane observed in the wild that chimps do not begin to fish until they're about 2 years of age, and from what we saw in the videotapes, this was exactly what we saw. We found no instances of chimpanzees under the age of 2 trying to use tools to fish for termites. Let's see, the next two clips will be of chimpanzees engaging in a little bit of stick play, engaging in a little bit of fishing, and a little bit of termite feeding, not using tools. So could we see the next two clips, please? Act up.
Ayan, nag-release.
Pause, please. Let's see. Now, in this last clip, this last clip is an example of one of the things that we found of particular interest to us, and that is observation of the model's actions by the juvenile. Now, this is really interesting to us because studies done by Tomasello on observational learning in non-human primates focus primarily on whether the subject produced the same behavior as that demonstrated by the model. However, it doesn't really look at what the subjects themselves were looking at. In other words, they weren't paying very much attention to the observational behavior of the subject. So it was very interesting to us to see that the young chimps, to see the intense scrutiny with which young juvenile chimps would look at adults using tools and watch how they and watch the specific trajectory of the tool being used by an adult. Could you please roll the next clip? At this point, we haven't seen enough data yet to be able to draw any definite conclusions about the development of tool use in young chimpanzees or the role of observation in learning. But hopefully we'll be getting more and more information as time passes. As you can tell, the archive is full of very useful information that you could not get, that I would not have been able to find otherwise. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Norm and Jim, and also Emily, for sharing their ongoing research. As you can tell, we're not so much arriving at firm conclusions as immersing ourselves in data and getting confused from time to time. I should mention also that the technology we use at Gombe for collecting this videotape data is a typical little Sony Handycam camcorder. Make quite good pictures. Probably our projection machine didn't quite mate with Emily's dubs, so that you got some rather strange reds and other colors, but we actually get quite good pictures considering the smallness of the machines. And the advantage of the very small machines is that we can go everywhere the chimps go rather than sticking around where bananas are provisioned and just getting the the things that happen at the center of their territory. We go everywhere they go. Well, now it's time for our feature event, and I think without any more ado, I'll simply introduce Jane Goodall.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Here I am at the beginning of another stage of my American lecture tour, and here I am back again at USC to fulfill my commitments to being here a couple of times a year. It's an exciting association because of the archives here, the people working on them, under Chris and Gary Seaman and Norm. And it's also exciting for a lot of students. There are very many students, and some have been asking me today about the possibilities of going to Gombe. And these days, going to Gombe is difficult, and it's increasingly difficult because the Tanzanian government is rather picky about whom they give research clearance to. And we generally have not more than 6 expatriate students, graduate or PhD people, and the rest are Tanzanian field staff whose kind of disembodied voices you've been hearing over these video clips. But having the archives here means that an awful lot more students will have opportunity to see how chimpanzees behave in the wild. And because the cameras are small and the tapes aren't that expensive, sequences can be shot that run for a long time, as opposed to professional filmmakers who come out and their film material is so expensive that they tend to take very short sequences, so you don't really know how a behavior began or why it ended. I'm going to use a few slides to run through some of what you've seen and some which you haven't. But before we start, I was thinking just now that when I began in 1960, when I was a young person, like the people you've seen standing here already today, we couldn't have talked about culture in chimpanzee society. And indeed, there are still scientists today who say culture is not anything to do with non-human primates. Culture lies only in the realm of human behavior, human societies. It depends how we define culture, and if we're going to talk about how young chimpanzees acquire culture, really how they acquire behavior, I think, is perhaps what I'll talk about. But if we're going to talk about how they acquire culture, and I believe they do acquire their own cultural traditions, we must attempt to define it. And the definition I've used and have used from the beginning is that culture can be a behavior that is passed from one generation to the next through observational learning. And you've already seen some examples of observational learning in Emily's pieces of video. Let's have the lights off and the slides on. And as I don't have a thing for the slides, I'll just go like that, and that means next slide, okay? And if we can make the lights go darker in the house, we'll see better, because, yeah. One of the reasons why there are so many people today studying the great apes, and perhaps particularly the chimpanzees, is that they are our closest living relatives. And this is why it was so absurd that when I first began in 1960, there were so many taboos about the words that we could use. And if we used words like culture or adolescence, childhood, reason, anything like this, these were anthropomorphic statements, absolutely not to be made by any respectable scientist. Had I wanted to study the chimpanzee mind when I went to Cambridge University in 1961, that would have been totally impossible because chimpanzees didn't have minds. So we couldn't have been sitting here as we are this afternoon thinking about something so utterly absurd as a non-human animal even showing something remotely like culture. And yet, I believe they do. This just illustrates to me it's rather a symbolic photo, a chimpanzee striding across the shores of the Lake Tanganyika. And this was why it all began. Louis Leakey, who was my mentor, was digging up early human fossils, the remains of our Stone Age ancestors. He was way ahead of his time in believing that if we learn something about the behavior of our closest living relatives, living in situations far more like those in which early humans lived than any tribe living today, that he might be able to guess perhaps a little more efficiently how those early creatures used to behave. Because of course, although bones fossilize and you can find the remains of stone tools and other things on the living sites, behavior doesn't fossilize. Today we accept this explanation. It's very well accepted all over the place, but in those days, Louis Leakey was way ahead of his time. Anyway, he finally got the money to send a young, totally untrained English girl, me, out into the wilds. It took him a year to get the money. Most people thought he was amoral. I wasn't allowed to go alone. I mean, the British authorities said, what, a young girl out into the bush alone? Absolutely not. So I had to choose a companion, and with me for the first 3 months came my remarkable mother. She who had nurtured my childhood dream of going to Africa at a time when it was the dark continent, at a time when we had absolutely no money, by simply saying to me when I was a child, Jane, if you really want something and you work hard enough and you take advantage of opportunities, you'll find a way. And I'm saying that deliberately this afternoon because there are young people here with their dreams. Don't be afraid to follow them. But remember, you have to work hard, take advantage of opportunities, make them even, and never give up. It was very exciting to see for the first time a chimpanzee using an object as a tool, because when I was growing up in England, we were taught at school that the one thing that differentiated us most of all from the rest of the animal kingdom was the fact that we used and made tools. And so when I saw David Greybeard, this is not David Greybeard, when I saw David Greybeard using a grass as a tool to fish for termites and sent a telegram to Louis Leakey, adding that not only did he pick a little piece of grass to use, but also might pick a leafy twig and strip the leaves off, or a wide stick and trim off a piece of bark, Louis made his now famous remark, haha, now we must redefine man, redefine tool, or accept chimpanzees as humans. And it was very exciting, too, in those early days, back in 1960, to find that chimpanzees were not the vegetarians that everybody had thought until that time, but that they hunt, they can show sophisticated cooperation, and having made a kill, they may share the flesh. Craig Stanford here has been out in Gombe studying colobus monkeys, and the poor old colobus monkey is the main prey of the chimpanzee at Gombe. But since we're talking about culture, we find that in different parts of Africa, chimpanzees have different preferred preys and may actually catch them and hunt them in different ways. The chimpanzee society is absolutely fascinating. It was very hard to come to grips with in the early days when I was not able to get really close to the chimps, when I was watching from a peak through my binoculars. And it was hard to make sense of the constant comings and goings of these fascinating creatures. They live in what Hans Kummer called a fusion-fission society. That is, members of a community, about 50 strong for the most part at Gombe, members of a community continually join up into different composition of little groups or parties, as they're called, and separate. Chimps may wander about by themselves, or they may occasionally gather into large, excitable groupings. This is a reasonable-sized group resting, grooming each other at the feeding station in the Gombe National Park. It's a mixture of adult males and females and youngsters. And here's a family group. It's the family groups that remain stable month after month and indeed year after year. And between family members we have very strong bonds, affectionate, supportive bonds, forming and lasting. And it's within the family context that we see so much of the early development of the child, how socialization occurs, how the child gradually acquires the different feeding traditions, cultural traditions, tool-using patterns of his or her community. The family remaining stable is the setting for the child in his early learning experiences. And this is a female known probably to everybody here, the old female Flo on the left-hand side of the screen with her bulbous nose and her ragged ears, looking down at her first known grandson, little Freud, Fifi's firstborn child, and Fifi being groomed by her son, Flint. That's just one example of a family group. And now, considerably later on, well, 5 years, almost to the day, after Fifi gave birth to Freud, she gave birth to her second son, Frodo. And even though the elder son, Freud, is now weaned, traveling on his own, sleeping by himself at night, he remains emotionally dependent on his mother. He's always there, traveling around with her and with his young brother. The two become constant playmates, and there is actually, and we need to analyze this, but there actually seems to be a difference in the frequency of lone play, and particularly innovative lone play, in firstborn and secondborn, thirdborn youngsters in a family. And this, I believe, is because the firstborn is spending many hours, if not days, on his own with his mother, whereas the subsequent youngsters born into a family have an elder sibling always there, or almost always there, and almost always ready to join in a game. So it's like a built-in playmate. And I don't have examples of this here, really, but also a built-in role model. And young infants spend hours watching what their elder siblings do. They very often imitate that or try to. And I believe that when we've carefully analyzed the mother-infant data over the long term, which is happening now, that we shall find that second and subsequent youngsters born in a family develop much more precociously. And that goes for socialization, tool-using behaviors, and independence from the mother. This is just one shot to show Fifi's family as it was about 6 years ago. Fifi, you can just see the hand of her latest born, her fifth born, Faustino. She's had one more infant since then. Her firstborn, Freud, wandering off into the forest. 5 years younger than 20-year-old Freud is Frodo, ready to follow his brother. Fifi is grooming her 10-year-old daughter, Fanny, an adolescent. 5-year-old Flossie is climbing down the tree. So these are the typical spacings between live births in chimpanzees in the wild. And just an example of another kind of family grouping. This is an adult female with her first infant. This is Gremlin and her elder brother, Goblin. And because there are these bonds that persist over time between family members, it means that family traditions can be passed on from one generation to the next. There are, we believe, traditions in the routes that individual females take when they move through the forest from one food source to another. And the offspring, as they grow up, will tend to follow those same routes even when the mother is no longer there, or when they're independent from the mother. The chimpanzees appear to inherit a certain number of sounds, vocalizations, postures and gestures that are part of their innate selves. And we find these postures and gestures wherever we look at chimpanzee behavior. Some rather cruel experiments, very cruel experiments, were done in the early 20s when young chimps were raised in social isolation in little chambers, rather like Harry Harlow's monkeys. And it was found that these socially deprived infants did show most of the postures, gestures, and sounds that we associate with normal adult chimpanzee communication. But when they had the opportunity to interact with other chimps, when they weren't being attacked or attacking because they were very socially naive and inept, they tried to use these inborn communication patterns, but they used them in the wrong context, in the wrong sequence. In other words, they didn't really know what they meant. But of course, in the wild, there's ample opportunity to learn. First of all, you learn by doing what your elders do at the same time as they do, so you learn a lot about the context, when it's appropriate to behave in certain ways. And here is a chimpanzee group. We didn't have a demonstration of a pantoot, but these are giving the distance calls, the pantoot. And it's not a very good example of what I'm trying to say, but there is an infant on Flo's lap over there on the left. And just as you heard the little wah of infant Flossie in one of the sequences of video today, so the infant chimpanzee begins to make the same sound as the adult at the same time as they do. So they learn the appropriate contexts for the different sounds of the non-vocal but non-verbal communication repertoire of the chimps. And here, again, two infants. These two females are flinging their arms around each other and making excited food calls. Didn't do a pantoot because my voice isn't very good, but there the young ones are. They're present as these two mothers engage in a sort of orgy of contact-seeking, calming themselves down. They've seen a sudden surprise bowl of bananas, and before they can even take a single fruit, they just have to get calm enough, which they do by embracing. It's like fans in some ball game, but anyway, there the infants are. They're present when all this goes on, and so they learn the appropriate context and the time and what it all seems to mean. And here again, intently watching grooming. Chimpanzees raised with humans know how to groom, but this demonstrates not only the way that behavior is developed in the child, in the wild, but also, as you saw earlier, that intense fascination with the behavior of others. If infants weren't fascinated, interested in what was going on around them, they couldn't learn, even if they had the ability to learn by observation and imitation. But young chimps, as they get older, as Emily says, when they're around 2 years of age, they're absolutely fascinated by the behavior of others. And that's the first step for observational learning. First requirement for it. Here again, another grooming slide. And as this young male grooms the female, you see the infant's little face watching very close, very fascinated. And usually they'll put up a little hand and start to do the same thing. But if it's grooming, well, it turns into play, and they start patting the adult with their hand, and it all turns into a game at this age. Foods. Now, we might think, gosh, out there in the wild there's all sorts of good foods to eat, and if they're edible, the chimps will eat them. Not true. Baboons, yes. Baboons, I think, will try, sample, and either eat or reject almost every kind of food in their environment. They're great opportunists. Not chimps. Chimps are conservative, like people. I mean, the people living in parts of Europe are horrified at some of the things that people eat in Africa. Some of the people in Africa are horrified at the things that would be eaten in the United States, and so forth. The chimps are just like that. The infant, first of all, tastes the food from the mother's mouth and subsequently watches very carefully what she's eating. And in this case, the infant is watching an adolescent female eating a long, wriggling green caterpillar. That is not a normal part of the diet at Gombe. They're just occasionally eaten. And the infant's a little bit apprehensive, hanging on to mum for reassurance, but completely fascinated by what's going on. We've found, in fact, that mothers or even elder siblings will occasionally flick away a piece of food that an infant is starting to eat if it is not a part of the normal adult diet. Now, we know we are able to compare the feeding behavior of chimps at Gombe and 100 miles south in Mahale Mountains, where the Japanese are working. In many cases, the same foods are present in both places. But although the vast majority of those edible foods will be eaten by both groups, some are not eaten in one place, others are not eaten in the other, and sometimes there are different ways in which the same food is eaten in the two different places. So these are feeding traditions, again, passed from one generation to the next through observational learning, through trial, through imitation. Same sort of thing, this close attention here. One infant has moved over to watch what his companion is feeding on. Watching what their eldest brother, Fifi's last two infants, watching their elder brother, peering into his mouth. And this fascination in the behavior of others persists through adolescence and into adult life. So adults are curious too, and when they see a new behavior, they sometimes come over to have a look. It's not just infants who show curiosity in chimpanzee society. The tool using. Well, here's a really clear picture of how the termites hang on to the stem with their mandibles, ready to be picked off and crunched up by the chimpanzees. Our old friend Flo again. And as you saw before, the watching, here a female she's actually picked a large stem and she's about to strip off a little piece of bark, and the youngster is watching. And here, about 3 years old, the youngster already beginning to show the tool-using behavior, the appropriate tool-using behavior of the adult in the termite fishing context. At Gombe, chimpanzees use many objects for a whole variety of purposes. In fact, chimpanzees use more objects as tools in a greater variety of purposes than any other creature except ourselves. Here, Fifi, as a juvenile, is using a handful of leaves as a napkin. Another youngster has bitten her bottom, and she's using the leaves to dab away the blood. Chimpanzees at Gombe use sticks as part of to enhance their charging displays, hurling them through the air, but also quite deliberately as weapons, as clubs in intimidation displays. And this has been seen in chimpanzees right across Africa. They can use rocks as missiles. Fifi is about to hurl a rock at a baboon in a feeding context. Some chimps throw with really good aim. Others are rather wild, and fascinatingly, throwing goes in families. And probably here is passed on by observation and imitation. I mean, maybe there's a gene for throwing, but it doesn't seem terribly likely. Some families throw and some don't. And in the throwing families, the young females throw. Most females don't ever throw at all. Fifi does. And at Gombe, chimpanzees use strong sticks to fish for biting army ants or driver ants. Now, at this point, I should say what I think most of you know, that in different parts of Africa where chimps have been studied, they have quite distinct tool-using traditions or cultures. We can't really know exactly how these all began. Sometimes they seem to have become extinct in a group and then start up again later. These are all things that I believe represent the cutting edge for what we need to learn about chimpanzee research in the future. What is the extent of variation in behavior between different populations or even different communities across Africa? And I'll just give you a few examples. Here, the stick being used to fish for army ants. In parts of West Africa, well, in Ivory Coast actually, the chimps eat safari ants, but they use little tiny sticks, and they just dabble the stick when they see a trail of these ants crossing the path and pick the ants off the stick with their lips. And yet, in Gombe and in Sierra Leone, they use almost identical methods of fishing for these ants, stripping bark off a stick, making it all nice and smooth, sweeping it through the hand when ants have clustered on one end, and eating it. In Mahale Mountains, 100 miles south of us, the chimps don't eat safari ants at all. They haven't discovered how to do so. Or maybe they once did and they don't anymore. In West Africa and parts of Central Africa, chimpanzees use rocks as hammers and rocks as anvils. They may use pieces of heavy, hard wood as hammers too. And this female has a nut which she's placed on her anvil, and she's using a rock as a hammer to crack it open. And there's her infant, Christoph Bosch, who's made a point of studying this, along with Tetsuro Matsusawa, have written detailed and fascinating descriptions of how infants watch the mothers. And Christoph maintains that mothers may actually help their infants to acquire the correct technique. This appears to be harder than termite fishing because the youngsters aren't proficient until they're more than 5 years old. And here, this is again in Côte d'Ivoire, and the female over on your left is using a 2-kilo rock as a hammer. And she's got a nut, one of these really hard panda nuts, on a rock anvil on the forest floor. The infant's been watching her, but now he's moved over and he's watching the adult male who's taken one half of one of the female's cracked open nuts, and he's using a little twig to poke the meat out of the nut. So here the infant's able to observe 2 different kinds of tool using in one session. A fascinating thing is that when chimps are presented with novel problems, and this is more often seen in captivity or in some contrived situations in the wild, such as this, when faced with a new problem, chimpanzees very readily turn to the use of objects to try and solve that problem. Tool using is something they turn to readily. So here there are bananas in this closed box, and the female has gone and fetched a large stick. I think it's about her 4th stick. She's using it to try and prise open the steel lid of this box. And at the back there's a hole with a rope going through it, which we've tightened the whole thing to try and prevent the chimps from taking bananas all the time. This is going way back to about 1965. We were very primitive in those days. And so the chimp at the back, it's the female with her infant and the infant's companion, and they're both carefully watching the female. She goes away to prepare a new tool, and you can see, or at least I hope you can see, that both infants have taken up little twigs. And so they're showing the same kind of behavior in response to trying to solve the same problem. Infants of this age almost certainly wouldn't have hit upon using little twigs if their mother or the adult female hadn't demonstrated first, at least the infant nearest to you. When a firstborn child, and to some extent other infants, are growing up, they do spend a lot of time with their mothers away from other adult chimpanzees. That's just chimpanzee female nature. They are quite solitary for quite long periods of time, some being much more social than others. And I said earlier, I think that in some cases, firstborn infants tend to show more examples of lone play and to show more imagination in the kind of lone play that they indulge in. And I'm putting in this sequence to show the kinds of objects that they play with, the kind of objects that could be used as a tool in a novel situation. In other words, how do these different kinds of tool-using behaviors start in different parts of Africa? They must have started somehow. And we presume that a sort of lucky or genius chimpanzee sometime in the distant past hit upon termite fishing or ant fishing or using leaves as napkins or whatever. And because it was adaptive, others were fascinated and then were able to learn by observation and imitation. At any rate, mothers usually play with their infants. They're not always in the mood, and then the infant must amuse him or herself. This mother is very half-hearted as she responds to her infant trying to get her to play. The infant is sort of laughing a bit, and she's clearly bored stiff. So, this is upside down. Never mind, we'll leave it. You can imagine. I mean, it's a bit like a gymnast, isn't it? Swinging round and round and round. But in the wild, there's plenty to do. And this slide isn't very important anyway. But he's hanging upside down, and that can be. Oh, this is upside down too. This can become a habit or a fashion among the young ones, and it was fascinating to watch his young brother trying to hang upside down. I mean, this is brilliant, this particular picture, but believe me, he wasn't doing this. This is upside down. Interestingly, when chimpanzees were shown slides like this upside down, or one of them immediately turned his back to the screen and put his head between his legs. Now, I wonder if any of you had the impulse to do that, because if you didn't, that chimp was smarter than any of you. Thank goodness we're back to the right way up. Okay, you can play with all kinds of objects. And here we're just playing with a rock, but there are lots of different games that you can play with rocks. You can play with sand. Now, this was very innovative. Only this infant ever has been seen playing this particular game, and he played it quite often. And he seemed to be trying to catch it in his mouth, but he was so afraid of getting it in his eyes that most of it ended up on his belly. I speculate that had other infants watched this, they would probably have copied. But every time I saw him doing it, it was when his mother was interminably fishing for termites, and he was bored stiff, and this was just something to occupy his time. Well, it's not adaptive to play with sand, but it might have been. And here now, this is a fascinating one. You all know that gorillas beat their chests. We used to have one chimpanzee who would hit his chest like this when he was displaying, and another one who would actually stand up and go boom, boom on his chest. So, you know, a gorilla type thing. And that was back in 1961, 62. And since then, we've never seen anything like that. Although we saw one infant who sadly died do it once before he died. So maybe the tradition would have passed on. We think that infant was the nephew of one of the males who did it. But anyway, this is Freud, and he's using his tummy as a drum in play, you see, like this. But that's just the kind of thing that he might have developed as he grew up into his display. He didn't, but he could have. See, I'm trying to give you the idea of the kind of things they do, and if we stay there long enough, we're going to see something exciting happen. We will. A couple of 100 years, and here again. This youngster, Flint, is using a stick, and he's using it to kind of tease, smash a little insect that's walking along the ground, using a stick as a club to smash something, the sort of behavior that might lead to nut cracking, if these chimps crack nuts, which they don't. But I mean, it could lead to it. And here we have, I don't think this shows very clearly, but what's happening here is that two young chimps are using a leaf sponge to get water out of a hollow in a tree trunk. And the female below is watching intently. Now, this is one of the traditional tool-using behaviors of Gombe. You crumple up a leaf in your mouth, and you dip it with your hand into a little hollow in a tree trunk where there is water, which you cannot reach with your lips, a leaf sponge. This has been seen in other parts of Africa. In some other parts of Africa, chimps dip in their fingers and lick them. So it has been invented in other places as well as Gombe. I suppose parallel evolution. But now look at this infant. Here he is sitting by an open stream. Chimps drink from the water by crouching down and sucking it up with their lips. But he's poking a leaf into the stream. It's kind of play, I suppose. And in this little sequence, he picks the leaf up covered in water and sucks the water out. He's made a little leaf sponge. And this shows how a chimpanzee can use an acknowledged or one of the traditional tool-using patterns of his or her group in a new context. It's rather like one of the scenes in Emily's video, which wasn't very clear, unfortunately, but it did show the chimp using a little twig, and it looks as if he was fishing for termites in his mother's hair. So he's got the idea, and he's using it in a novel context, and that might produce something fascinating. Now, this is anting. This is something which in 34 years we never saw at Gombe, but it was the most commonly seen tool-using behavior in Mahali, 100 miles to the south. And the closest we saw to they eat carpenter ants, sort of large black ants that make nests in hollows in tree. Well, they bore little tunnels, and they have their nests inside the branches or trunks of trees. And the Mahali chimps are fishing for them very, very frequently. At Gombe, I once saw an infant get a little twig and poke it in a hole, because infants love poking twigs in holes. And out came a few carpenter ants, and the infant jumped back startled, and the mother came up and looked, and she actually picked off one of the ants and chewed it up. Well, just last year, early last year, I was visiting our project in the north of Gombe. That's the community to the north of the main study community that's being habituated to the presence of humans. And lo and behold, we find that in that community, but not the main study community, the chimpanzees were showing this same anting behavior. Now, how weird. That's north of our main community, and Mahali is 100 miles south. So what's going on? At any rate, very soon after we realized that the Mitumba chimps were anting, just like the Japanese chimps, the Mahali chimps, 2 young chimps in our community were seen anting to the manner born. And it's after 34 years of not seeing it at all. And believe you me, that means it wasn't happening, because we have hours and hours and hours and hours of observations. So why suddenly did this start? Was it like a kind of disease blown by the wind from Mitumba? Well, just before this was seen, about 3 months or 4 months before, a young female transferred from Mitumba to our main study community. And she produced an infant. And when young females produce infants, youngsters are absolutely fascinated. So although we unfortunately didn't see the progress of this, at least one possibility is that this female from the north did her usual anting, was closely watched by a couple of youngsters of our main study community, and she was fascinating to them because she had a new baby, and they picked up the behavior. But as I say, we don't know, and we wait to see whether anting will gradually become a commonly observed behavior in the main study community. This is a captive chimp, of course, but he's using a twig to scratch his chin. He doesn't need to use a twig to scratch his chin, but it's fun. And captive chimps are often terribly bored, which is why we have programs with the Occupational department at USC to help enrich the lives of captive chimps. We used to do it in the Los Angeles Zoo. He's amusing himself. And this is one of our orphans in Africa. And actually, she's in Africa, but she was born in England. She was almost killed twice by her group. The mother rejected her. They tried to reintroduce her to the group, and she was almost killed. So the keeper is now manager of one of our sanctuaries in Africa, in Kenya. And he got permission to take this little chimp out. She will be introduced into the community in Kenya. Now here she's drawing, which captive chimps sometimes love to do. Some captive chimps love to do. And I just couldn't resist this one because she's growing up with little Oliver, and he came over. He's just about the same age as Sophie. And he came over, he displaced her from her drawing, and he'd been watching her very carefully. So this watching and observing and learning can go both ways. And Vince, Oliver's father and Sophie's mother in a way, believes that Vince has learnt an awful lot from Sophie, and that he behaves in many ways like a little chimp and not like a little human, because his only peer is a chimp. Now this is entitled Concentration, and just look at it. Could you possibly imagine a better photograph to illustrate all the things I've been talking about? It's got the intent observation, the possibility of learning, a very complex procedure here. It's not easy for a young human child to tip liquid from one narrow-mouthed bottle into another. And I mean, look at those expressions of concentration. I mean, every little muscle in his body is devoted to doing this task as well as he possibly can. And then I just wanted to, I've just got a few pictures here, a bit of a cheat really. The reason I'm not sitting at Gombe and doing this data, the reason I'm really delighted that young people are now working on the data at USC and other places is because I honestly can't. Knowing what's happening to chimpanzees across Africa, knowing how their forests are going, knowing how mothers are shot so that infants like this one can be sold, sometimes to dealers who smuggle them out of Africa for entertainment or biomedical research, knowing how they're treated in so many zoos and circuses and advertising agencies, and above all, medical research labs in the United States and parts of Europe and the rest of the world. How can I sit in my little jungle paradise? So I have to use the energy I now have to try and pay something back, as well as to share with as many people as I can something of the wonder of these non-human beings. And that's another reason why it's so wonderful to have this archive here at USC, because we can share with so many people eventually the amazing behaviors that these non-human relatives of ours show us. At any rate, this Sierra Leone, he doesn't want to leave us. You can tell he's close to death. He needs his mother's milk. He's got a few bananas and a bowl of water. He needs his mother's love. He's got nobody here who understands his needs. Sorry about that. At any rate, we now have become, we, the Jane Goodall Institute, have become involved, whether we like it or not, in caring for orphan chimps confiscated by the government or handed over by people who misguidedly bought them as pets. And this is part of our chimpanzee group in Congo, Pointe Noire. And this is the wonderful Graziella Kotman, Belgian woman, who is helping us to care for them. You see here a part of the growing family. It's like a nightmare because Conoco, the oil company, built us a sanctuary for about 20 chimps. Graziella is already looking after more than 45, and will it ever stop? And it's very expensive. We have to care for these infants. We have to give them love, but also food. I think we better stop somehow. If these slides aren't going to... Oh, there we are. Okay. Well, we have to... When they first come in, they need special nutrition if they're to get over the trauma of losing their mother, of having shots in them, of being incarcerated in tiny, tiny sacks or tied up with wire, and they have sores all over their bodies. And so we have to feed them up. That's why it's so expensive. And that's why any of you who like to join our institute will love you forever, because it helps us look after some of these little orphans. But what I really wanted to show you, oh dear, was this. This is Jenny. And Jenny lives in Congo, and she was bought by a Congolese who didn't realize that buying her would perpetrate the trade. He really loved her. He had her in his house, but then he went away on an extended visit, and the rest of the family didn't like Jenny in the house. They shut her out. She's only about 2 years old. She desperately needs contact with another caring adult being, and the only caring adult being she could find was Henry. And so, to everybody's amazement, Henry actually adopted Jenny, and when he went around the streets of Brazzaville scrounging, he took Jenny with him. Sometimes she was riding on his back. Well, she got a bit heavy for Henry. The owner came back. We persuaded him to give us Jenny, because we've never bought a single chimp, and she has become integrated into one of the groups at the sanctuary in Pointe Noire. Those are the little chimps you saw earlier, and that is part of their sanctuary. So when I last went to Congo, I was so pleased to see Jenny part of a happy group. But then I started worrying about Henry. I mean, poor Henry's lost his companion. So Graziella said, "Don't worry, Jane, I'll talk to the owner. He's really a very nice man." And so when I went back, I went to see Henry, and we couldn't get in, but the owner indeed is a very nice man, and Henry now has a canine companion. So that's the end of the slides, and what I think I would like to do now is to open the floor to questions, including if you have questions for any of the previous presenters. Yes?
I noticed the use of both hands, or have you noticed the preference for left or right hand?
Please, I can't see a thing. Thank you. Can people hear the question? Yes? Can you hear at the back? Yes. All right, that's what I wondered. Okay, the question is there a hand preference? They're all ambidextrous, but there is clearly a hand preference, and it seems to be about 50-50% right and left. But people are still studying this, and clearly with left and right and language, it's an interesting subject. But they're all ambidextrous, whichever hand they prefer. Yeah.
Is there a lot of similarities between the pygmy chimpanzees and the larger ones as far as culture and food preference and that kind of stuff?
The question is if there's a lot of similarity between these chimpanzees and what used to be called pygmy chimpanzees in culture. Bonobo, yes. They actually, if you're a chimp person, bonobo are as different from chimps as they are from gorillas. I mean, they really do seem to be very different. They behave very, very differently, and their sounds are very different. It's actually said that bonobo, the people who study bonobos become kind of besotted with them. And, we have a sort of cult of the bonobo people. And they believe that the bonobos are much more intellectual than the common chimpanzees. Well, the chimpanzees, the bonobos that we hear about the most are Kanzi and the other Panbanisha who were raised in the Yerkes language lab, which have the most amazingly enriched environment. I mean, it's quite unbelievable. There are people with them right around the clock, 24 hours. They have toys, they have stimulation, they go for walks, they have books, they have television, all the time. So now they're raising one bonobo and one chimpanzee together. And there are some very interesting differences in the rate at which behaviors are acquired, but it looks as though they're actually going to come out about the same in the end. They do say, though, that the bonobos seem to be more, to use vocalizations more like language than chimpanzees. And when they're trying to teach the bonobo to say words, which of course chimpanzees can't, they say, well, the bonobo can't say banana, but it can say ah. So this, we need a little more research and evidence. And I don't know, I haven't watched bonobo much myself.
So, on the distinction of man and other animals, which we concluded early, Jason Young, the neurologist in England in about 1968, came to the conclusion that we are the only species that, using tools and written language, build models for survival. For example, we write laws and social behavior, that sort of thing. Do you find any evidence in the chimps that they do anything, I say, build models for posterity, or that all is within the current living generations, that sort of thing?
Well, I'm sort of tempted to make a comment about our policy for survival, because right now it seems that we're very rapidly heading through our policy for total destruction. But I mean, given apart, no. I think he's certainly right. I think if I'm asked to to point to the one behavior that differentiates us most from the rest of the animal kingdom, it's that we and only we have developed a sophisticated spoken language. Chimps can be taught sign language, 300, and gorillas, 300, and bonobo, 300 or more signs. They can learn to use lexicograms. It can be very sophisticated communication. But they haven't developed that in the wild. It's not to say they won't, but they haven't. And it was Konrad Lorenz who said that once you have language, you can become a cultural creature. Without language, you can't. Truly cultural, depending on culture, because only when you have a spoken language can you teach your child about objects that are not present. Only when you have spoken language can you discuss the distant past. Only when you have spoken language can you make plans for the distant future. And I would say, most important of all, only when you have language can you bounce ideas back and forth between one mind and another. And we all know, I mean, if we try to imagine living without words, it's very difficult. We're a really wordy species. I mean, listen to me now. I don't know how long I've been talking, quite long. But we really do. We depend on words. And once we can do these things, then, and only then, can we start relying on culture. And the chimps have the beginnings of culture, but they need the objects present in order to pass on the behavior to the future. And we can do it without. So yes, the chimps, therefore, could not make a policy for the future. Theirs is very simple, survival of the fittest. If your plan doesn't work, you die. You don't pass it on. Yes? Do we have multiple births? It's fairly, well, it's not common in captivity. They say it's about as common as twinning in humans. We've had one known case of twins in the 35 years at Gombe, one possible case of twins. We don't know because we didn't know the mother when they were tiny babies. She may have adopted one, but she did have two. And in the case of the mother with known twins, Melissa, she simply did not have enough milk. She couldn't cope with two. They remained tiny. I mean, it was so sad. When they were 9 months old, they were the size of a normal 2-month-old and everything. And then one died of pneumonia and the other one began to make up for lost time. And he's still small, but he's really quite someone, Gimbal. He's a great guy. Goblin's young brother. Yes? The alpha male is Fifi's son, Freud, her eldest son. He took over at the beginning of last year. He's a real laid-back alpha. He's really nice. He's a great guy. He's being eyed by his young brother, Frodo, who is the biggest, meanest chimp we've ever had at Gombe. He's actually dangerous. Well, I think to answer that as best I can, it seems very definitely that if a young male has a mother who is assertive and high-ranking, and above all one with relaxed relationships with the adult males, then he has a really good start in life. And then you have this wonderful progression. As he gets older, he's all assertive because she's been backing him up, so he's very brave, and he can tackle quite big females and even young males. And there's Mum to back him up. But then he reaches too far, and he attacks a higher-ranking one, and Mum comes to defend him, but it's too much for her too, and she gets defeated. But all the time he's growing. And so the mother is being brought out, as it were, into interactions with higher and higher ranking individuals as he gets bigger and stronger and more ambitious. And then he starts helping her raise her rank. So it goes like this. And so Fifi, with two elder sons, is the highest ranked female. And she supported both of them in early life because she was supported by her brother Figan, who was the top ranking male. So I think there's no question. What is equally clear is if you're a female and you have a low-ranking mother who is very non-assertive, you haven't a hope. You will never become high-ranking. Whereas a male with a low-ranking mother can, by using his natural gumph and intellect, as his testosterone levels rise, he can overcome his timid mother. I can't really hear. They're very dynamic. Young males are very dynamic, and they're always looking for opportunities to raise their status. Some a lot more than others. I mean, there's a difference. In just about all aspects of behavior, we see tremendous individual variation. Yeah?
If you teach chimps sign language and then put them back in the wild, will they maintain that?
If you teach chimps sign language and put them back in the wild, will they maintain it? One, they'd be killed because they kill strangers, sadly. But no, I mean, it's like if you take a Frenchman and teach him English and then send him back alone to France, do you think he's going to speak English? Nobody'd understand him. If you put a whole group of signing chimps, they would almost certainly maintain some signals between themselves because it becomes habit. But mostly they would move over into chimp talk. Would the Frenchman teach his kids? I wouldn't imagine so. Only the Frenchman would teach his kids French. Frenchman would teach his kids English if he was still among English-speaking people. And Washoe, the first chimp ever to be taught sign language, adopted an infant, and no human ever taught the infant anything. And he lived with Washoe and 3 other signing chimps. By the time he was 8.5, he'd used 56 signs in the correct context, with no human tuition at all. And my favorite example there is somebody, I was in Reno the other day with the gardeners who did this, and I came up to this story and thought, oh my goodness, my sign language really isn't very good. But I told the story anyway. But Washoe is sitting with Lulis, and Lulis is about 1.5, that's her infant. And she sees Roger Fouts, I don't know what you want to call him, her adoptive mother, I suppose. Anyway, he's coming towards her with a bar of candy. And Washoe gets all excited because she loves candy, and she starts swaggering about, and she's signing, "Hurry, give me candy." And she suddenly looks down at little Lulis, who's just sitting, watching, because he doesn't know what's going on. And she stops all her swaggering. She goes over to him. She takes his little hand, and she makes the candy sign. She molds his hand on his cheek, as her hand had been molded by Roger. You see? So she's doing to him what was done to her. Do as you would be done by, or be done by as whatever it was. Yes?
Are there same-sex behaviors among the chimps, or are they all heterosexual?
They're basically, in the wild, they're all heterosexual. In the bonobo, there is what they call genital rubbing, GG rubbing. And females will turn at the slightest excitement of any sort, they turn their rumps to each other and rub. They're always swollen. They rub their sexual swellings against each other. And the males mount one another a lot, but without penetration. So certainly as far as chimps are concerned, they're very heterosexual, actually. Yes?
On the matter of, do they have any social behavior that, in the sense, would be akin to what we would call law, in the sense that do they correct them and punish them for acts that are not accepted by the community? Maybe that kind of thing.
Do you come from the law school? Is there censorship? To some extent there is. You have some alpha males in particular who will intervene in a squabble and stop it. Goblin used to do it a lot. Chris Boehm has made quite a study of this conflict intervention. We had a cannibalistic pair, a mother and daughter, which we don't understand, but they began systematically attacking every newborn infant in their community in 4 years and killing them and eating them. And they only did this. A lot of people ask the question you ask in relation to that. How could they get away with it? Didn't anybody care? Well, the answer is they only did that when there was no one else around. And because females, particularly with new babies, spend a lot of time alone, their victims were very often in this vulnerable position. And one mother guarding her baby can't do much against two determined females. And nevertheless, one of these mothers who lost one infant gave birth again, and she would repeatedly, every time she saw Passion and Pom, she'd rush up to a male, look at Passion, scream, look back at the male, soliciting his help. And somehow, I don't know how, but somehow a message seemed to be conveyed, and the males would go and discipline Passion if she caused females to scream. I had to write a paper which I could send you if you're interested, for a legal journal. And I wanted to call it The Law of the Jungle, but in the end I called it Order Without Law, because there's nothing written, but they do have an innate system which gives some kind of justice. But really and honestly, in chimp society, might is right.
Are there any other chimp behaviors?
Incest between mother and son, we've only seen one example, and that was so traumatic to the female, who basically was raped in the end. That was Melissa and Goblin. And they had this incredibly close relationship, and Goblin supported her against Passion and Pom. He was with her when her twins were tiny. He was fantastic. And they had this real close relationship, frequent companionship. But after he did this attempted rape, and he actually penetrated, then this whole relationship broke down for about a year. She gave birth to a baby. It wasn't his, because we had her followed every day, and it wasn't for about 10 months that she had a baby. But, yes? How do captive chimps do when they're reintroduced to the wild? Well, we can't. You see, wild chimps are very aggressively territorial, and any strangers they are likely to kill. And if we possibly could reintroduce our orphans back into the wild, we certainly would, because it's so expensive caring for them. We can't, you'd have to find a big island where there were no people and no chimps and all the right food. And islands like that are already occupied by people. And if you put them back, you can teach them to live in the wild. That's not too much of a problem. It just requires patience. But you'd have to find a place with no wild chimps and no people, because if there's people, they'll wander up, they're dependent on them and probably get shot. So it's one of our nightmares that we can't put them back in the wild unless we find the right place.
Years ago, when the population split and the one population came back and attacked the other population, did you ever figure out why that happened?
The question is about the inter-community conflict. It lasted 4 years. First of all, our main community divided, and then systematically the males of the larger portion attacked individuals or pairs of chimps of the smaller southern community. And over a period of 4 years, they annihilated that smaller southern community, except for adolescent females who were recruited into the main part of the community. And then, after this smaller community had been annihilated, the victorious males and their females took over the little area which the smaller community had called its own. But then the males from the further south, very big community, they began moving across. And our community had to give way because there were more males there. And they came back and back and back. At the same time, a large community in the north was moving south. And for a while, we thought we would lose our community because it was having, normally it has 15 to 20 square mile range. It was down to 8. And then, fortunately for our study anyway, the adolescent males began accompanying the big males on their boundary patrols and joining in with pantoots. And this apparently was sufficiently inhibiting to the northern and the southern communities that they started giving ground again. And it's since then it's been a pretty well a status quo. We still see exciting boundary conflicts, but no more warfare. But we don't know why. We have to wait much longer. Yes? The genital rubbing, he's asking if we see genital rubbing, GG rubbing in chimps like bonobos. No, we have just occasionally, we had one male Faban who rubbed his rump on other males when he was really excited. But that's it. And then the only time I've seen something that could be vaguely related to GG rubbing in a female was Fifi, when she first started getting her little sexual swellings of her sex skin when she was about 10 years old. She became increasingly possessed by total fascination for anything to do with sex. And as soon as she'd see a male going up to mate a female, she'd go rushing over. And she got this weird habit of turning her rump to his while he was mating. And she did that many times. We even there's a picture of it in Shadow of Man. And then, believe it or not, her daughter Fanny did that. So I went back all through the records, and yes, Fifi had done it when Fanny was there as an infant. So Fifi carried it on, although it became very rare. And her daughter Flossie did it too, not to the extent Fifi did. So I don't think anyone's going to tell me that's genetic. I think they learned it by watching Fifi. Yes?
Has the kind of territorial warfare that you observed been seen in other areas of Africa among the chimps?
The territorial warfare has been, Christoph Bosch has seen his males patrolling and attacking strangers. In Mahali Mountain, they had the same kind of situation where a larger community attacked the males of a smaller community, in this case not the females, just the males. And it seems likely that this kind of behavior occurs everywhere. They haven't got much evidence yet in Uganda. I don't think they didn't have. But then the Uganda chimps hardly use tools either. Richard Wrangham calls them the country bumpkins of chimp society. Yes? What do I choose as a substitute for chimps in biomedical research? Well, first of all, what are we using chimps for in biomedical research? They're being used by and large, or have been, for hepatitis and currently, to some extent, for AIDS research. Chimps can be infected with both those viruses. They don't get the symptoms. And there are, so basically the rationale for using them is, one, to study their immune system, but secondly, to test vaccine. So you get your vaccine, you vaccinate the chimp, then you challenge him injecting the AIDS or whatever it is, virus, the HIV virus, and see whether the vaccine in the living chimp will kill the virus. There are an awful lot of scientists working on AIDS who don't believe it's useful to use chimps at all. The people who believe it's useful to use chimps, by and large, are the people with chimps in their labs. In other words, they must get grants coming in to maintain their colonies. And I think the most interesting observation here is right at the beginning, there was a sudden panic. There weren't enough chimps. And there were certain people in NIH trying to turn over the law, which makes it impossible to import wild-born chimpanzees into this country. And it was Robert Gallo, the joint AIDS vaccine virus discoverer. It was Robert Gallo who stood up in Congress one day and said that the lack of chimpanzees was making it impossible for him to move forward to discover a cure for AIDS. And this was when the panic began. And even in Tanzania, there were hunters coming in trying to get chimps. And the government was approached by a Swede who said that they were sitting on a gold mine and could he set up hunting. Well, fortunately, we were able to control this in this country. But 4 years later, or even 3 years later, Robert Gallo was at a big AIDS conference, and he stood up and he said, the trouble is that my research and all AIDS research today is boxed in by inappropriate results from research with chimpanzees. And I spoke with him, and he's used one chimpanzee only in his entire research. And whatever we think of his ethical conduct, nevertheless, he has been a major mover in AIDS research. So the point here is, first of all, is it necessary to use them? And there's a very interesting paper coming out in Nature, I think it is, in May, which I do not propose, I'm not qualified to judge its merit. But what it is basically saying is that the AIDS retrovirus probably started hitting people because of chimpanzee research, because viruses that have lived for millions of years in primate hosts don't want to kill their primate host. That doesn't do them any good. But if you let them cross over into another species, one of two things happens. One, the virus will die, and two, it may start replicating in the new host, but the host isn't balanced with it, and it can kill. So now I don't know if this is true, but if it is, there's going to be a cat among the pigeons in the primate research labs. Alternatives are the studies, clinical studies of people, epidemiologists make studies, and carefully watching the progress of the disease in people, the people who do get it, the people who don't. I'm not a doctor, so I can't really answer you, but all I can say is we do have to think about, do we really need them? And then start wondering what they're needed for, if they are needed, could be done in another way. Does that give you a good enough answer? Yes?
Can you give us some comments about the amount of purposeful activity that the chimpanzees engage in and levels of health? If there's any sort of relationship?
The level of activities in a child or an adult chimpanzee? Either. Well, the level of activity of chimps in the wild is, in infants, it is absolutely, they are like hyperactive children. They are always on the go, and if they're not, they're spread out asleep. And, they can be so dead to the world, the mother can actually move away and leave them. They're really tired. And if she wants to calm the child, the only thing she can possibly do that may help is to groom, and that does calm down an excitable child. The adult's level of activity it depends how much food there is. If there's plenty of food and they don't have to travel too far to get it, and it's nutritious, so they don't have to spend hours and hours eating minute little things so that they have to fill up their stomachs. Then they spend a lot of time playing, and I don't think there's any actual results from the data. I don't think anybody's analyzed to be able to exactly answer your question. Did the more active chimps seem healthier? Well, I suppose I would think of it the other way around. The answer is probably yes. because I would say, yes, chimps that seem really healthy are more active, and when they get sick, the level of play decreases and they travel around less. So yes, the answer would be yes. But I kind of put it the other way around. Yes?
Chimps have been seen hunting prey. It's been said they do this not only to gain food, but also for social reasons. Do they use this to gain mates, or is it to establish dominance between the group?
Well, you know, this is a theory of some people, and I don't know that I particularly hold to it. Certainly, male chimpanzees, when they get very roused during an inter-community conflict, for example, when they're roused like that, then they actually may hunt. So that it seems as, you know, when they're in this level of arousal, they actually want to go and hunt. It's almost coming back to your question. But yes, when a male has meat, a female can come and beg from him, and he may be allowed to mate her, and she may be allowed to take meat from his mouth. But, I mean, that can happen with other foods too. And I would say that the primary goal of hunting was nutrition. That's my own feeling. But if there were other people, particular people here, they would argue with me.
Jane, why don't you take one more
Well,
question?
you choose it then.
Who has the last question?
I'd like to ask,
All right, two then. We'll do the last two.
Two last
in
questions.
cases of illness or injury of an individual, how is the handicapped or temporary impingement handled within the group?
Okay, well, if it's an infant, the mother will care for the child and carry it around and look after it. If it's an older child, so that the mother has another small infant, then the older sibling will sometimes care for a younger sibling. If a mother dies and leaves an orphan, almost invariably it's an older sibling who looks after that orphan, even if it's a male. And young males make absolutely fabulous foster parents. In fact, the little Mel who you saw on the video briefly, he was adopted by a young adolescent male, 12-year-old, Spindle, who saved his life. There's no question. He carried him, he shared his food, he protected him from male displays and attacks. In general, care for a wounded chimp is either within a family or not at all. They're not very kind. If an adult gets injured, the others aren't particularly kind to that individual, not like elephants who will really go and help a wounded comrade away, or dolphins who will carry a sick infant up to the surface to breathe. So they're not terribly altruistic, except within families, and then they are very altruistic.
If you have a handicapped adult, would the others in the family make sure that handicapped adult got fed?
Well, the only cases we've had of that was the polio epidemic in 1966. And when individuals appeared walking in odd ways because they had paralyzed limbs, the others were terrified of them and avoided them and shunned them. And it was very hard to watch. And it's probably adaptive, because if somebody's really sick, you should keep away, or you might catch that disease. We haven't seen too much of that. Which was the one you picked?
This one, is there any evidence of speciation among populations that have been isolated from each other, if they are in fact been isolated?
We haven't studied enough remnant populations. I mean, there are very few he asked about speciation in fragmented populations. There are very few chimpanzee studies, mainly because it's very expensive. And if we don't get more chimpanzee studies in different parts of Africa, we're going to find that when all you young people here grow up and want to go out in the field, or your students want to go out in the field, there won't be chimps left, because they're going so fast. You know, which is one of the reasons why I'm traveling around talking to groups of people to try and raise funds to get more research out in the field, as well as working with local people, with governments, trying to introduce agroforestry around areas that should be protected, because if you don't do something for the people living there, they're not going to respect laws, because they might die from starvation first. So you find, as you become interested in conservation, that you become increasingly political, And also, of course, as we look after these orphans, the fundraising becomes a tremendous problem because it is expensive. Congo Brazzaville is the third most expensive capital in the world because the currency is tied to the French franc. And this is why we have a program for young people that's now in about 30 countries called Roots and Shoots, roots that creep quietly under the ground and make a firm foundation, shoots that seem new and small, but to reach the light can break open brick walls, so that hundreds and thousands around the world can change the world. And I'm trying very hard to get some programs going in colleges and universities, people who will go to the children in the primary schools and start to teach them a little bit about the environment, about animals, and about each other, how we share the world, and the problems of the world are shared around the world today. Because we've finally begun to understand that if we don't change our ways, we don't try to heal the wounds that we've inflicted and continue to inflict, then the outlook for tomorrow is very bleak indeed. And a lot of environmentalists would stand where I am and they would tell you that it's too late. They actually, I've heard them. They'll say it's as though we're in a train going very fast down a dark tunnel with no headlights and no brakes. And when I say I think there's hope, you know, people will look at me and say, but Jane, you just crawled around the forest with monkeys. How can you possibly argue with these people who produce all their statistics? And I say to them, well, if you went back 100 years and you started talking about email and faxes and journeys to the moon and traveling in outer space and Concords and things like that, do you think they would even have begun to believe you? I mean, that would have been science fiction and impossible, wouldn't it? But you see, we did those things. And we did them not because our backs were to the wall, but because we were curious scientifically, because we hoped to make money. Now our backs are to the wall. Then hopefully we can use the brain that led to the technology that's led to a lot of good, but we now know is also in many cases destroying. Now that we know that, then I believe we can use that same little sophisticated piece of grey squodgy cells up here to work together and to invent the technology that will do things in a better way and begin to heal. We have to start with the kids. If any of you are interested in helping me with Roots and Shoots, you can either contact me right now or Chris Boehm, and he can give you the literature about it. So we need you. I tell my kids, I say, you know, each single one of you has a role to play in this life. You can't go through life without playing a role, even if it's a passive one. But more importantly, each one of you can make a difference. But you get to choose. Do you want to use the gift of your life to try and make the world a better place, or don't you care? So that's the Roots and Shoots message, and we would love somebody here to help us. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jane Goodall.
Yeah.